So, Daniel, what level will we be talking about this morning?
So this morning we are talking about level 2, which is a forest level of some kind.
All right.
There's trees in the background and they're all smiling away. There's beetles, there's bees, there's bee nests, there's dragonflies, caterpillars. There's also some alligators and there's some walking fire as well. So that's kind of the visual theme. Do you want to have a look at the individual challenges along the way, and we can talk about them in more detail?
Sure.
Yeah, it sort of starts off in the same way as the first stage, which is you've got a wave of balloons that go upwards. And you've got some enemies underneath that encourage you to jump. And then you approach the stag beetles, and they will climb up slowly, but they'll fall quickly. Yeah, and then there's a few more of those, and then there's some balloons, and it becomes a bit more challenging because they put 2 stag beetles on the one tree. Ho ho ho. Yeah, and then we get to the second sort of main section, which has the caterpillars and the dragonflies, and the caterpillars move around pretty slowly. In fact, most of the time for this section they're at the top, so they actually don't influence you in any way, but I guess they sort of do the trick where the player brings them into view and can see their behaviour, and therefore the player is aware of how they'll move before they have to avoid them later on, perhaps, I guess.
In the later levels, you start to get a sandwiching challenge where 2 enemies pressure you to balance in a space vertically. One, an enemy below you and an enemy above you. And so this is the first really generous version of that challenge.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's sort of an introduction to that. What do we get to next? We get to the bee and the fire character. So the fire character is a bit strange because it's not an insect, so it kind of stands out a bit more.
It's a forest fire.
This sort of is where that layering starts, where you've got these 2 different timers, but you've still got plenty of space on to move in this area. And then we get to another dragonfly caterpillar combo, pretty similar to the one before. And then we get to the alligators. So most of the enemies so far, if you touch them, you'll often bounce off of them and you won't take damage unless you touch them from underneath. Oh, except for the fire. With the alligators though, they're like a one-hit kill, however they're just on the ground. So that, their ability to kill you is balanced out by the fact that they're pretty limited in mobility and they move pretty slowly.
It's kind of interesting that they introduce these ground-based enemies in an area where you're incentivized to drop your balloons in order to collect the heart.
Yeah, that's right. And what's interesting as well is that there was a similar challenge in the first level, but you only had to drop your balloons. In this one, you actually have to drop your balloons and jump. So this is actually the first time where the player can jump on the ground to receive a reward. And so I guess, this is planting the seed for the later levels, especially the ice level, where you have to jump quite a lot. At the end of the alligator bit, you collect one of the balloons, and then the invincibility comes up and you can crash your way through the next area. It's kind of interesting because it looks sort of like there's a bit of a sandwichy thing going on here with the dragonflies and the bees, and then the stag beetles and the fire. And the balloons function like coins in Super Mario Brothers. They're a bonus that you want to collect. But when you're invincible, I think because the enemies are pretty close as well, they kind of sort of function as a bonus as well. So they sort of function like coins as well. And so it's an interesting challenge trying to kill all the enemies and also get all the balloons at the same time.
When you get that invincibility balloon, the sandwiching effect of the enemy becomes more of a... like you want them even tighter sandwiched so that it's easier to hit them, basically.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
One other thing I noticed here is that the jumping fireballs in this section jump a lot higher than the first one the one you counted earlier that was below the B.
Yeah, I think that's because they want to do like a sandwiching type challenge. If you stand along on the ground, right, then you can avoid the stag beetles fairly easily. Like, you don't have that constant vertical displacement to worry about when you've got the balloon.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see these enemies and you're like, oh, okay, well, I mean, like you said in the first section, like they jump like 1 unit high and you have to fly over them. But here, like, you can go underneath them. And they look like exactly the same as well, which can be a bit confusing in the moment, I guess.
So just a technical note about the rules on those pine cones is any of the dropping things in Balloon Kid will drop when Alice is in the adjacent horizontal tile, regardless of where she is vertically. But one, the pine cone is fixed to a log, and two, the log has spikes on it. So it's difficult to bring Alice right up next to the pine cone because you don't have anything to halt her momentum once you do get into that tile.
Yeah, I know what you mean. That's a pretty deep read there about the the fact that the pine cone is stuck into the spikes and therefore it behaves in that way. It's just on the nature of moving in this game. It's such that you can't really do what you can do in Mario. You know, like another trick that you can do in Mario where you can kind of move underneath something and quickly move back. Once you've kind of decided to move forward, if you go back the other way, you then stop and then you have to turn back around and you don't have enough time to bait the pine cones to fall. So basically this is a bit of a, you know, like an all or nothing situation where you have to swoop past both of the pine cones at once. Yeah, so this area is it's quite tight, I guess, because there's a beetle on the other side. You're likely to finish up near the red balloon to the right of the stag beetle, but if you're there and you've just finished moving, then there's also the broken pine cone that you have to deal with as well. So it can be pretty hard to avoid getting hit on your first few playthroughs of this area.
An interesting consequence is that if you do get hit and you're down to one balloon, then it's harder to get over that tall wall. Like, you face a greater threat of getting crushed against the screen.
Yeah, it's like it's not as balanced as the rest of the level. It's a little bit too difficult, I think.
Well, it's the climax.
Indeed. And then there's another area with a Game Boy that you can go down, and again it's signposted with lots and lots of balloons. There's another little area before with some horizontal trapping. And then we get to the first boss battle, which is some kind of angry fox, I think.
He's the big bad wolf.
Wolf. Fox. It doesn't have a tail. It looks like it's got a t-shirt and shoes, but doesn't have a tail.
Yeah, okay.
A lumberjack wolf.
Lumberjack wolf. Oh, and actually, an interesting note is that as you approach this area, the faces on the trees get angry, which is cute.
Yeah.
Now, if you are on the upper two tiles, the fox will turn to face the direction that Alice is at. So if she's on the left, the fox will turn to the left, and then he'll walk backwards until he reaches the right-hand side. So basically, if you're on either of the top two platforms, the fox will slowly move away from where you are, so that you have to do a longer jump to hit him. Whereas if you're on the middle platform where he is, then it will slowly walk towards you. It's a pretty slow walk though, so there you go.
The fox approaching you on the ground is a timer challenging you to get out of the way and hit the boss before he comes over and kicks you into the water. And if you're standing on one of the logs above, as he backs away, that challenge is more about your accuracy with Alice's jump. Because of her crazy momentum, it's a little hard to be accurate over longer distances. And so it's relatively safe because there's a lot of ground, but it's also hard to land actually where you want to.
I guess when you're on top, it's more of a defensive AI, where it's moving away from you, making it harder for you to jump on his head. Whereas when you're on the main platform in the middle, it's more of a offensive attack. Even though he moves so slowly that it's
Right.
It's barely here nor there, but yeah, it's still distinct enough. Usually on the trick here, like all the bosses, you used to just fall, land on its head, and grab your balloons again, turn back around, fall on its head. Unlike the fish battle later on, you can pretty much keep attacking this guy. Like, you don't have to wait for him to reach a certain state or to jump up onto the screen. Although there is a bit of cooldown, once you've attacked him, you can't just go straight back. There's a little delay there as well. I reckon the hardest thing about this boss battle is the bounce back, which can be quite unpredictable or can be quite hard to manage. It's probably the hardest part of this game, just the bounciness, and you see that a lot in this boss battle. The angle at which you bounce off is sort of like 45 degrees, I think. And because of the momentum of the game, you can't really then move yourself in midair. Like, there's not a lot of midair control if you don't have the balloons. And so you can't bounce off the head and then keep on bouncing off the head. You're too far away for that. So, yeah. And it's a nice introduction of the concepts that are explored in more depth later on.
The bounce back is helpful because, like you said, it tends to bounce you off. I don't know if it's exactly 45 degrees, but that's what it feels like. And so you also bounce quite high off of bosses. So
yeah, it sort of prevents that sort of ugly bit of gameplay where you've just attacked the boss, but you're right next to them, and their sprite is overlapping with your sprite, and you don't know when it's going to end. So it gives you like a period of separation, which is quite a clean way to deal with the idea of completing an attack and then letting the boss cool off. Sort of, I'm preventing on the player, from any cheap tricks, and also keeping the gameplay quite clean.
There is also that the bounce back makes it easier for you to go back to your log defensive position. What would you consider to be the theme of the level?
It kind of introduces the elements mostly individually. You've got the stag beetles on their own, the caterpillars and the dragonflies are put together, but it's pretty open-ended. The fire is fine. With the bee, it's still pretty open area. So, it sort of introduces quite a number of new enemies, usually individually or sometimes layered, but in a very open environment. And then sort of near the end, it starts to layer them up together. It's somewhat unfortunate that the player doesn't really get to experience or engage too much with that layering, because a lot of it's in the invincibility section. So it is some introduction for the first half of the level and some slight variation within each of the individual challenges. Like the stag beetles in the first instance, you get the first one at a certain angle, the second one's a bit lower. The third tree, you've got two at once, and then you escape, and then there's one more at the end. So there's a bit of variation within each introduction. It does get a bit trickier at points, but it's just basically a series of introductions of enemies and a little bit of variation within each discrete section, so that it becomes a bit more challenging. And it kind of doesn't really come together too strongly in the end. It's still pretty relaxed. And then there's the boss battle.
Yeah. Alright. Sounds good.